this paper is in the spirit of what Michael Collins called a foundational study, and that is a sort of a look back at what's been done, and where we should be heading as we engage in this great new effort on financial literacy. And the outline that I'll talk about is basically three things. First is what I think is the key moving parts in the growing interest in literacy. A second is review of what's been done. And the third is what you might think of as sort of a thought effort or a thought piece on where we go from here, what would be the most effective in terms of public policy. I think, it's now 2010. We now sort of understand the risks of the 401k system, which puts a lot more effort on the individual, a lot more information requirement on the individual than the old defined benefit system does. We have this very recent economic catastrophe fresh in our minds, which again reinforces the notion that people need to think real carefully about what they should be doing on the financial side. And so I think it's clear to say there's an increasing understanding that we need a more literate population in terms of financial issues. I'm not going to define, or I'm not going to fall on my sword about any particular definition of financial literacy. I think it's easier to define illiteracy, and that is basically you know it when you see it. Right? And Anna Maria and Olivia have some examples where they ask people, if you have you put $100 in a savings account, it earns 2% per year for 5 years. At the end of 5 years, do you have $102 more than that or less than that? And they ask a couple of other questions that are equally easy, almost ridiculously easy. And only half of the population gets those things right. Only half of the survey people get those right. And that's not even what you'd think of as a workable definition of being literate and able to use your money. It's just very extremely basic concepts that people don't get. There's many other examples of the illiteracy that's out there. I think my favorite, I recognize this as an anecdote, but I think it's telling. There was a survey a few years ago where something like 20% of the people said that the best opportunity that they had to raise several $100,000 for retirement was to play the lottery. And then they asked, well, what about, not just you, but what about the American public in general? And 16% said the best opportunity for the American public in general was to do the lottery rather than save. So we have a steep uphill battle here. And the other thing that hasn't been mentioned a lot today is the effects of illiteracy, and then there are implications for society at large. John Campbell has a very nice paper that talks about this a bit, about how the existence of people who are not sophisticated in markets can be exploited by people who are sophisticated. So there's a transfer of wealth from the unsophisticated to the sophisticated, but B, there's less of a market incentive to get the unsophisticated on track because the sophisticated are making money off of the arrangement. So there are interesting welfare implications that we haven't discussed that much. Let me just breeze through previous research because I think everyone here has looked at this stuff. There are basically four main ways that financial education has been offered: work, school, credit counseling, and community-based organizations. None of them, in my interpretation, have proven, I wouldn't say I was convinced that any of these things have actually worked. Probably the most compelling information is on the workplace education. Anna Maria has a paper, Doug Bernheim has a paper that shows that the exposure to education raises saving rates and contribution rates in the lower half of the earnings distribution. What's of concern there, of course, is you don't know exactly whether people are accurately reporting what their firm offers, what they've been eligible for. And the one experimental piece of evidence on this by Esther Duflo and Emmanuel Saez it tells a very different story. They pay people to attend a retirement fair, and the payment raises the attendance at the retirement fair dramatically, but it doesn't change eventual participation and contributions in the retirement account. So there's concern there that it would be nice if we, given the amount of employer-based financial education, it'd be nice if we had firmer evidence, I think. Curriculum mandates, there's a really interesting paper by Bernheim and Garrett and published in the Journal of Public Economics that suggests that there was a big impact on of these school mandates on people's saving and wealth accumulation. And then there's this incredible paper by Cole and Shastri that just blows the Bernheim paper out of the water. It presents a more general framework. It completely rejects the findings. They use census data, so they have hundreds of thousands of observations. They have very precise estimates. It's very hard to argue that their more general specification is not the right one. Credit and mortgage and counseling is really hard to get an experiment here because the people that show up are there because they need the counseling. There was one controlled study that by Agrawal and a sort of a whole team of people that looked at an experiment in Chicago. It was a very clever paper, actually. But the experiment imposed mandated counseling and review of contracts. And as far as their main finding is that it was the review of contracts that affected the default behavior subsequently, not the mandated counseling. In community-based organizations, of course, there are individual development accounts which have financial education requirements. There have been a couple of papers that looked at how exposure to financial education has affected people's willingness to contribute to IDAs. But although there is some experimental evidence on IDAs, there's no experimental variation in the education part. So that literature is not tremendously convincing either. There are two more auspicious strands of the literature. One is on the role of planning. And again, your name keeps coming up here. Anna Maria has done a very interesting work arguing that planning is correlated with wealth accumulation and arguing that it's causal. And there are three separate tests that have been offered in the literature by her co-author, and a paper by John Amarix and co-authors. One is using siblings as an instrumental variable, which is kind of interesting. One is using regional house price variation. One is using specially designed questions about planning. I'm willing to say, based on that evidence, that the results look causal. But if someone said to me, that's not totally convincing, I would say, yes, I agree, it's not totally convincing. But if we wait for totally convincing, we may be waiting for a long time. My sense is the evidence suggests that planning does increase wealth accumulation. I'd be interested to hear comments back. The other thing that works is making it simpler. The expression "keep it simple, stupid" has a lot of resonance, I think, in retirement saving. The simplest approach, of course, is just mandating that people sign up. The next simplest is opting in. But again, Anna Maria and the Bashirs, Leibson, Madrian, et cetera team have both showed that giving people simple choices raises enrollment rates much faster, or sets enrollment rates much higher than just giving them a whole menu of options. So I think those are two clues as to where we can head in the future. But let me mention three others. One is, as you know, if you've looked on the web, there are now thousands of financial websites. This is not necessarily a role for public policy, other than to maintain truth in advertising, make sure that conflicts of interest are made public. I think the main thing is let the private sector do its thing, and just sort of in the being the traffic cop or being the information. Regulating what they say it does not seem like a promising area for the federal government, but making sure that conflicts of interest are out there seems very important. Late in the project, I got thinking about a national campaign as a policy idea for financial education. And this is really interesting. I think there's a lot more work to be done here because we've done a lot of national campaigns: smoking, seatbelts, AIDS prevention, littering, war bonds in World War II. You can think of 10 more if you spend a minute on it. And there's an enormous literature. There's we found 500 articles on these campaigns, and we read 3 of them that were surveys. And so a couple things come out of this. One is that people need information from a credible source. We saw that earlier in the focus group discussion. The source has to be someone that they're willing to say, okay, I'm willing to listen to them. It can't be an insurance company. It can't be a brokerage firm. It needs to be collected in one spot. It needs to be accessible. And it needs to be just over and over and over again. People need to be hit on the head. There's no substitute for repetition here in the evidence. Social networks can help. And one of the really interesting things is that the eat your vegetables approach doesn't seem to work. So one of the famous cases in the tobacco industry, the anti-cigarette campaign in Florida, for years they tried to convince teenagers that it was unhealthy, and that didn't do anything. And then they changed gears and tried to convince them that big tobacco was trying to take advantage of them. And that worked like a charm, and cigarette usage rates fell dramatically. So thinking about exactly what the message is and how you get inside someone's head seems like a really important thing here. So I do want to mention two caveats from the campaign literature, at least relative to what I had expected. One is that even in the most successful campaigns, no more than 20% of people change their behavior. In fact, 20% is at the upper end. The average is like 9 or 11% in these campaigns. And when you think about it, I mean, my image was basically nobody wore seatbelts, then we had a campaign, and now everyone wears seatbelts. And that's just wrong. The seatbelt effort is like 15%, 17%, or something like that. You just don't get these really huge changes. So you go back to these questions about whether 2% over 5 years gives you 102, more than 102, or less than 102. If only half the population is getting that right, we're not going to get that up to 95% of the population unless this is by far the most successful campaign in history, right? We might get it up to 60 or 65, but even so, we've got a third of the population that can't say that 5 times 2 is more than 2. So we just need to be realistic. Then the other concern about financial education or financial literacy in the campaign is there's not a simple message. It's not wear seatbelts. Or put the cigarette down. It's what the financial literacy message is to be determined. But whatever it is, it's not simple, and so that's going to make a campaign harder. But I think that's one area for public policy. The other area that I just want to mention at the end is we do all these different things to encourage people to save. We have these mandates like Social Security. We have incentives like 401ks. We have default options, or either auto 401k or auto IRA, which my colleagues and I have proposed. And we have the offer of information, which is financial education, financial literacy. Most firms think of these as substitutes. That if you're a firm, you're trying to meet the non-discrimination rules, you can either offer more information, or you can offer a higher match, an incentive, or you can automatically enroll people. Okay, so we've sort of been raised to think of these as substitutes, but I actually think of them as complements. And that is, if you think of these things working together as a package, they make a whole lot more sense than if you think of them one at a time. So you have an incentive, you encourage people to save by raising the return, raising the reward. You set up the architecture so that they participate, the default option. And then they've got this money in the account, it's growing over time. There's somewhat of an obligation at that point to teach them about it and how to use it. And then done as a package, you can see that each of these things could plausibly have a bigger effect jointly than any of them would individually. And the best example here is for low-income households. The Savers credit provides a nice incentive for save, a very high effective match rate, but it's complicated and people don't understand how it works, so nobody uses it. Automatic enrollment gets people into the plans, so if you have the incentive and the automatic enrollment, that's great. You've got people participating, earning a lot of money. Then if you give them literacy lessons or education on top of that, then they can understand how to use the funding. And so I think that notion of the options as complements and financial literacy working with the other components of a saving package rather than at odds with is a potentially helpful vision as we move forward. And the conclusion just says all the things I just said. So with that, I will stop. Thank you.